Good morning. It is Tuesday, January 9th, 2024, and this is the Jefferson Public Utility District special meeting. My name is Jeff Randall. I am the president of the board, and I am calling this meeting to order. Start by ensuring that we have a quorum. And I've announced myself, Jeff Randall, District 1 Commissioner, President of the Board.
Kevin Collins, Commissioner, District 2.
Tupper, Commissioner for District 3.
Okay, so I will start by making a little announcement. So we're calling the meeting to order. Jefferson PUD will be offering both virtual online meetings as well as in-person meetings unless advance notice is provided. Online participant audio will be muted upon entry. Please unmute at the appropriate time to speak. And if you're calling in, use *6 to mute and unmute and *9 to raise your hand or request to speak. So we did the commissioner roll call already. Agenda review. So we've got a presentation by FCS and an executive session, actually 2 executive sessions. Do we have anything else to add to the agenda? And I was just going to check in maybe at the end of the meeting because we've kind of changed how we're going to conduct the times that we're going to start meetings. So I'm just going to do a little reminder of the public that the next meeting, regular meeting will start at 4. And I'll just ask you if you think we'll have any executive sessions, but we can have that discussion maybe at the end of the meeting. So with that,
I'll make a motion to accept the agenda as presented.
Second.
Motion and a second on the agenda. All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye, and we have an approved agenda. So I'll turn it over to Kevin.
So this is first of several meetings that we'll have with FCS. We are extremely pleased to have kind of the team put back together. Sergey, if you remember, a couple of years ago, spent a lot of time with us and, really have done a good job. We have a presentation for them on pole attachments and then a real brief starting of rates for the discussion in 2024. Mike?
So yeah, today we're just going to talk about our pole attachments for present an updated rates. We're out of we use the 22 rate for billing pole attachments for 23 because we didn't get everything done in time. So they're going to give us a quick update on what we should be charging going forward for pole attachments, and then just a kickoff into as we get ready later in springtime to do our cost of service study and rate study. So appreciate everything that FCS does. Sergey and Matt, they've already put a lot of work into this and just ready for them to go ahead and start presenting. Okay.
And I have a question, Mike and Kevin, for how because I can't remember how we've handled the pole attachments. When we did the rate study the last couple of times, we've not just looked at the next year, but we've looked at multiple years, and we've had kind of adjustments that go into effect, increasing the rates a little bit each year. And then we can always, take action to not do that planned adjustment. I know, and I think with pole attachments, we hadn't had a history of looking at them that frequently. So I'm wondering, when we last did the pole attachment rate change, did we include any sort of increase kind of adjusting over time over multiple years, or how did we handle that?
So the last time we adjusted it was in for the 21 rate period, and then the 20. So we did 21 and 22. So we did a 2-year rate period. 23 just kind of got away from us. We were going to look at it in early 23, but between our schedules, FCS's schedule, we didn't make it. So we just used the same rate for 22. Because we went into a scale, because you are right, we haven't touched pole attachment rates since we started as a PUD.
Okay.
So it was 9, 8 years, I guess, that we didn't touch them.
Okay.
I think staff's been gathering data too, right, in the last year. We haven't gotten with FCS, but I think we've been gathering data. Is that correct?
Yes, we've gotten some better data that they were able to put together. So I know Matt, they will talk about that in today's presentation, but so when we did a 2-year phase in to bump us up to where we're at. We were at right now, their current rate is 22.45. And I know Matt will talk about it more when he gets going on his presentation, but so it's however the commissioners, but we do the pole attachments separate from all of our other rates.
Understood. But we did do It was one rate and the next year it stepped up. So
Do a phase.
okay.
We could do a phase in on the
I
slide.
We
appreciate that.
we chose not to go to the amount allowed. We stayed way down below, so.
Yeah.
Quick question is, does Sergey want to take questions along the way in each section, or does he want to wait till the end?
I think it works either way for us. I think a good discussion throughout is probably works great.
Okay, well, I'll just ask folks, because I find this helpful myself. If there's a slide that's up and a commissioner has a question that basically we don't understand something that relates to that slide, ask your questions during the presentation. But I would say otherwise, let's try to hold them till the end, because I think it does interrupt the flow. But if there's something that's up there and you're like, I don't get it, tell me more, please ask your questions. So let's try it that way. Sergey, take it away.
All right. Well, good morning, commissioners, and thank you for taking the time to meet with us this morning to go over the poll attachment update and just get the rate study process kicked off, kind of focusing on a quick refresher of what actually goes into it. First of all, can everybody hear me okay and see the presentation that I'm sharing?
Yeah, your audio is great.
Yes.
Great.
Sure.
Well, as I was introduced, my name is Sergey Tarasov with FCS Group, and with me I have Matthew Hobson, who has been focusing on the poll attachments and will be walking us through that portion of the presentation. Quick overview, our initial focus will be on the fees themselves. We're going to do a really quick background in terms of what they are, the basis for calculating them, kind of that legal authority to assess them, the methodology we developed and updated last time around, and then the updated results. We'll definitely want to have a discussion in terms of the approach that we want to take for the charges this time around. Do we want to do the calculated rates? Do we want to do another phasing approach? So that'll definitely be a question that we want to focus on towards the end of that portion of the presentation. And then we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the rate study. I know it's been a couple of years, so we'll do just a high-level refresher. We're going to be going over some high-level data for all the components of the study. And we'll do, as we go throughout, we're going to do a reminder of what some of the policy decisions that were made about all the steps of the analysis. So it's kind of a combination rate fundamentals discussion, a background, as well as what we're looking for here is to hear any kind of goals and objectives that you want to see. If there's something that you've been wanting to address through the rate study, any kind of rate structures that you want to look into and investigate, it'll be a great time to let us know. And we can always come back and ask, get that direction later. But if you have anything or if you have any questions as we go, please do let us know today. Now I'm going to hand it over to Matt, and then he's going to walk us through the poll attachments.
Great. Good morning. Good morning. So just in terms of background, Matt Hobson, I led the poll attachment fee update that was completed for the PUD back in 2020. About 16 years of experience in utility rate setting and been with FCS for about 7 of those years. So just a quick agenda for where we're going to be going over this first half of today's content. The PUD requested that we update the poll attachment fees as part of this rate study process. And so we have about a 10-minute selection of slides that will present an overview of the poll attachment fees, as well as a primer on how they're regulated in the state of Washington. We'll quickly cover the key assumptions and methodology that we used for this study update, as well as the previous update, and then provide the summary of the results. I know there was some talk early on in this conversation that it was great in that we'll be presenting what we consider to be the just and reasonable rate. The PUD historically in 2020 adopted an increase, but not to the full just and reasonable rate. And that's still a discussion point for today's meeting. As a when we were in high school or middle school and you were in a math class, you could always go to the back of the book to look at the answers. And so I'm going to do that right now, and we'll go to the back of the book. Generally, our results are showing results very similar to the 2020 numbers. A slight reduction in adjusted reasonable rate, but only just slight. And so we'll jump into the numbers here as we go forward. And Sergey, you can stay on this slide for right now. So as a quick primer, the PUD rents space on its utility poles to about 11,900 private telecommunication attachments. In addition to these private attachments, you also include around 1,300 of your own fiber attachments on electrical poles. When we look at a pole attachment fee, we're looking at not just space that's rented by private entities, but also space that you're using for your telecom and fiber attachments. Across the country, pole attachment fees are regulated either at the state or at the federal level. In Washington state, they're regulated at the state level. And the revised Code of Washington, Chapter 54, provides us that framework for designing these fees. The number that we generate is what would be considered a just and reasonable rate. And the RCW 54 also provides guidance on how we go about calculating this rate. One point I want to bring up is unlike the rate study process where we're looking at forecasts of expenses and revenues and capital projects, pole attachment fees have to be based on actual operating expenses. And so you have to look backwards 1 year in arrears to come up with these numbers. Next slide, please. So the formula prescribed by the state of Washington actually includes two separate and distinct formulas. The results of each of these formulas, these two formulas, are assigned a 50% weighting, and then we sum those two results together. Prior to 2019, the language in the RCW about these two formulas, they were commonly interpreted as the pole attachment methods prescribed by the Federal Communication Commission, or FCC, and the American Public Power Association. Unique to Washington State, in 2019, an appellate court ruling provided additional guidance for pole attachment fees in this state. And the 2020 update that we completed for the PUD, as well as this update, is aligned with that methodology of the appellate court. In 2020, can you back up one slide there? Sorry. In 2020, we came up with a just and reasonable rate of $33.89 per attachment. At that point, the PUD was assessing $12.45 per attachment. And so the board adopted a 2-year phase-in, moving the fee from $12.45 to $22.45, which is the rate today. Next slide. So at a basic level, the state statute dissects a utility pole into two pieces. The first piece is what we consider or define as usable space. And this is space on a pole that can be used for electric supply for the PUD, or it can be rented out to private attachments. The second kind of category of the pole, or the anatomy of a pole, according to a pole attachment fee, is support and clearance space. This is the space of the pole that's underground. It's the space of the pole that goes from the ground to the safety space to allow space for the cars to pass under the pole. And we refer to that as support and clearance space. And really it's common space that should be recovered from all attachers of that pole. Nobody's directly renting that space, but there's a cost to have that pole on the ground. Next slide. So the cost basis for these fees, as I mentioned, there's two formulas, and I'll go through those very quickly here. These two formulas are designed to determine the cost per rentable foot of space on a pole. The first formula develops a cost per foot based on the potential rentable space on a pole. Not the amount of actual attachments, but potentially if you were to maximize the attachments on every single pole, how many attachments would that be? And we're going to take the total cost of all poles divided by the number of potential attachers. The second calculation only looks at your actual renters. So it's not looking at potential attachments, what's actually being rented out. So generally, when we look at the second calculation, it's going to produce a higher cost per foot because we're not looking at potential pole space users, but only actual space renters. Next slide.
Hey, Matt, can we go back to that one for a second? Because this does, for me, fall into the category of I need to understand it or at least try to understand it. It's possible that my brain isn't going to be able to understand this. So I'm going to try and read this back. So pole attachment fees. So the result of each calculation is assigned a 50% weight. So does that mean that those two calculations down below each is assigned 50% of what you end up with the total? Is that how you're?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. Mhm.
Then the first one, clearance space based on potential attachments. So this is looking at that portion of all our utility area, because you had a very nice map there. This much of the pole can be used attachment. So that's like what the total potential area is that we could rent out and could be used. Is that what that first one is saying?
Yeah, that's great. Let's stick with the graphic here, Sergey. So when we look at the two darker gray shaded areas, electric supply and telecommunications, that is space that can be directly rented out by the PUD or used by the PUD. So
Got
we
it.
come up with a very clear cost of that space.
Okay. So we're
Where-
looking at our total inventory of poles and that much of it, and how much do we have and how much does it cost to maintain that availability basically to the telecommunications industry?
Yeah, so yep. So we come up with basically a direct rentable space for that telecommunications shaded area.
Got it. Okay. And then back to your other slide, the next one.
Yeah. So this slide looks at, well, how do we allocate that common space? Everything else that we can't directly rent out, but that for which we incur a cost. How do we come up with a cost recovery of that common space? If you go back one slide, Sergey, the common space is this light shaded area, the safety space, ground clearance underground. There's a cost to have of this space, but we can't directly rent it out to anybody. But we have to have this space to be able to rent anything out to anybody.
Okay. And then into these calculations, is this part of what the RCW is basically saying?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I think my P brain has gotten as much as it's going to get out of that, but thank you for slowing down and covering that.
I'll peel one more level of the onion back here. So how important is it to identify how many poles, the space available, i.e. versus a transmission pole versus a distribution pole, where that space could vary, how many attachments you can get on those poles? How do you weight that as you go through? It would seem to me you're going to have a pretty fair accounting of the what the height of the poles are that we have in the system.
Exactly. And that's going to be yes. And so we have to look at the height of each pole. And that's going to be one of the changes that we identified from the 2020 update to this update is as you've done an asset assessment on poles over the last several years, we've identified a few additional poles, but also we've been able to fine tune the actual length of these poles. And that's changed a little bit of the calculation for this update.
So how confident are we, this is maybe to the manager as much as you, that we have a 80%, 90%, where are we at with being able to account? I'm not looking for a solid number, but how confident are we that we've got a good enough of a sample to estimate those two numbers, the height, because of the height of the poles?
We
Yeah.
have best guess today at the PUD. We will, as time goes on, part of what we're doing on the broadband side, they actually measure every pole. They put a pole attachment at their location, who it is. So within 4 or 5 years, we'll have excellent documentation. Today, I would hesitate to even give you a percentage. I don't know, but we are getting better. And because of broadband and the benefits bringing to the electrical side, we will have that information to you within a couple of years.
And I'm just going to correct for the record. The manager said best guess, but I think what he really meant is based on the information we have now on our polls, which is what it is, but we can always get better and more accurate data, which we strive to do.
When we took over, we didn't get pole heights for the poles.
Okay.
So we have slowly added heights and gone through and done small things to improve our mapping and our GIS information.
Thank you.
I have another question on pole height, but we'll wait till we get to a different slide further on before I ask the question.
Okay. Looks like you're good to go, Matt.
Let's jump to perfect. Thank you. So this is the resulting percent of space on a pole that's allocated to each attachment for those two calculations. As I mentioned in the previous slide, that second calculation, because we're only looking at actual attachments, it tends to produce a higher cost share. And you see that trend here play out, that the first calculation, which gets 50% of the weight, is based on potential attachments. We're just going to have a lot more potential attachments compared to actual attachments. And then the calculation number 2 is the cost allocation based on actual attachments.
So this confuses me. I'm looking at calculation 1 being a fifth of calculation 2. And please explain it to me.
Matt, is that simply just because of the vertical height of the pole and the amount that each one is doing? You've got 1 foot of that pole that's available to be attached on, but you've got another, let's say 20 feet or 15 feet that's there to hold the other foot up. So you just got more pole that falls into calculation 2 as opposed to calculation 1. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yes. And just to give you some numbers to back that up. So the average pole in the PUD, let me get you the number here. We average about 2 attachments per pole that's actually being used. Now, each pole, if you look at what you could attach based on our numbers on the size of each pole, you could potentially attach 15 attachments per pole, a 1 foot attachment. So there's a lot of space that could potentially be used that's not being used right now because pole attachment fees pole attachments are based on supply and demand. You need to have a utility or some provider who needs to use that space. And as I mentioned, it's not uncommon for that second calculation to be much higher because we're looking at just actuals attachments, whereas calculation number 2 looks at, if you look at the space that you have available to rent out, you divide it into 1 foot increments, how much space could you potentially allocate per potential attachment?
Well, I'm hoping that when you get into actual numbers, this makes sense, but I think I kind of get maybe what Commissioner Collins's confusion is because you started off by saying each one of these makes up half of what we can charge. So anytime you get into, one multiplier, 1 percentage times some other percentage, it gets confusing. So I'm confused too, but I'm hoping by the end I'll understand.
Let's go to the next slide. I think we'll show the numbers. Or actually one more slide from here. Sergey, if you can just jump to the next slide. Okay, let's start here. So we're going to play this out for the 2 methods and then show how they come together. So in the second column titled allocated space with a little parentheses A, we're showing those 2 percentage points. That for every attachment under calculation A, we would assign 6% of the cost of a pole to that attachment. In calculation number 2, which is based on actual attachments, we'd allocate 30% of that common space to every pole. Our average cost of a pole in 2022 is about $1,136. That's per pole.
Does that include the cost of the pole?
It does. So this is the gross investment cost of the pole. So this is not the maintenance of the pole. It's simply what we paid for to install it. The carrying charge in column C is designed to represent the annual operating costs of that gross investment pole. So if we pay $1,100 per pole, we're going to incur about 15% of that cost every year for operation maintenance, for depreciation, for an allocable share of administrative costs, and any cost of interest on the debt of our assets. And so we multiply, basically just go across the numbers here, 6% times $1,100 per pole, times the annualized cost of 15% of that cost each year, times a weighting of 50%. And that produces that first kind of 50% of the pole attachment rate basis, or $5 per attachment.
So Matt,
Mhm.
I'm going to look at item B. I'm going to go back to that one and a little more clarification here on how we're determining the average investment cost per pole. This is a manager question probably as well. If we have a 45-foot distribution pole and we sink it 6 feet in the ground, we're paying for a 45-foot pole, but are we only charging for the above ground part of that pole? Or are we taking as if it were like a 35-foot or 40-foot pole? How's it the height of that pole really determined at the end of the day for our investment into that pole versus a 65-foot transmission pole, where you're sinking more of it in the ground and there's not as much of it above ground to work with? it's a different charge for each of those poles. Are we capturing that full cost of purchasing those poles in this number?
I can answer at least the financial part of the question. To come up with this figure of $1,136.36, we're looking at the overall initial investment of all poles in the utility, and dividing it by the number of poles we have on record. So it's an average investment cost per pole. We're not looking at what you paid for every different pole in the utility by height size. We're taking the overall sum of investment of all poles divided by the number of poles in inventory.
Because that gross investment number does matter when you figure the final result. That is, to me, that's the important part of that equation. Are we capturing the complete cost of that pole and pole assembly?
So I'm gonna jump in here, Matt, for just a second here. So that is, they look at our capitalized costs. So this is the cost of labor, the cost of the material. It's the cost of, if a contractor has to go out and do any work. It's the complete cost that we capitalize on a pole. So if we go out and put a 45-foot pole in, at the end of the day, it's gonna cost us X. We go put a 65-foot pole in, it's gonna cost us Y. They both get capitalized at the same amount. They look at our gross assets, capitalized costs, and divided by the number of poles out there and get the average. So this is an average total investment.
And that's why I asked earlier about what kind of numbers do we have associating a transmission pole versus a distribution or a telecom pole?
Well, I think for this number, it wouldn't matter, right? It's a gross number. It's all capital costs related to poles, whether it's transmission or distribution.
Yeah, so I think the answer is yes. We're getting that. It's just they're not doing each individual pole one at a time. They're doing the gross aggregate, but they're absolutely calculating that by the sound of it. And it sounds like it's also a highly regulated process by which we get to do this calculation, but it sounds accurate.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, just to be clear, the highly regulated part of this process is what the commissioners are responsible for.
Right. Well, I guess
Prescribed by statute and regulation, but
Yeah,
you are the regulators.
I'm saying that the regulation, it's the RCW, it's the court case, and then finally we get, the information is presented to us, and then you're right. Someone else isn't deciding this. We are, but we're working within a framework that is established. So that might not have been the best term.
I will point out real quick, these are poles that were put in the 40s. This is what we own today, not just what it costs us today to put a pole in.
Please continue, Matt.
Okay. Now, I did want to point out that the result we're coming up with, which is highlighted in gold, this is what we would consider to be the just and reasonable rate based on 2022 actual data. Is about $32 per 1-foot attachment. When we did this work back in 2020, we came up with a slightly higher rate of $33.89. It's about $1.89 lower than we came up with 2020. The primary reason for the decrease in the rate is as a part of the district's condition assessment of poles. The district was able to identify that the poles that have been added to the inventory have been slightly higher than we had in 2020. So the poles are higher, which means we have now more potential space to rent out. And as a result, it lowered the rate per attachment. And if you go up one slide, Sergey, just want to highlight those differences. These are some key infrastructure metrics that we compiled for the 2020 update and the 2023 update, showing the differences in these key metrics. The average pole height in feet did increase, and it's a direct result of the assessments that have been done over the last 3 or 4 years, where we've added essentially the average height of those surveyed poles has increased by about 2 feet per pole. The space occupied per attachment has not changed. It's still a 1-foot attachment space. Our gross investment pole cost has increased, which we would expect as you're replacing poles, older poles with more expensive current poles. We expect that to go up. It didn't increase substantially, only $11 per pole. Our carrying charge remained pretty much identical to the previous update. And our attachment per pole, the number of things we're actually attaching to each pole also remained fairly constant between the two updates. So the major change, as we saw, based on the assessment of conditions of the pole, we saw the average pole height increase. As that number increases, we would expect to see a decrease in the actual fee per pole, which is what we did see. Okay. So the just and reasonable rate we've come up with is $32 per attachment. The existing rate as it exists today is $22.45. So there's a difference of $9.55 between the just rate versus what you're currently charging. Last slide, please. This is a comparative survey of pole attachment fees in the region. The first gold column is PUD's actual rate as it stands today, $22.45. Many of these rates and these jurisdictions that we showed 3 years ago, these rates for them now are higher, as we'd expect. Just like the PUD, other utilities are also updating their pole attachment fees every year or on a frequent basis to capture increased costs. If you were to adopt the just and reasonable rate, you'd be at $32. Which is kind of in the middle, a little on the higher end of the middle jurisdictions. So just to conclude kind of this part of the presentation, this is an update to the pole attachment work that we did in 2020. Generally, what we saw is the just and reasonable rate remained kind of on target, what we saw 3 years ago, a little lower than when we came up 3 years ago. And it's in a direct result of just the conditions assessments we've done, or the PUD has done.
Matt, excuse me. If all of the PUDs are following the same formula in updating their rates, how do you explain the very large variation from Klickitat up to Cowlitz? Why should there be such a variation?
Yeah, if I can respond, I think it's a function of two most common explanations. Is number one, some utilities have a higher demand on their poles than other utilities. So in a dense urban environment, will have a lot more demand on those poles compared to a rural utility. And then the second kind of function is when it comes down to the actual rates that are charged, they likely, hopefully take into account what the just rate is, but PUDs have the authority to set rates below that number. And so we oftentimes see is the approved rates that are assessed to attachments can be lower than the actual cost. And that's a policy choice for each district.
And if I may add to that point, is that when we surveyed these utilities, some of them haven't changed, while quite a few have. So some are choosing by policy not to update them or not to update them yet. That's just a pure policy decision. I know that one of the utilities on the list is going to be going up even more. We just didn't list the draft rate because they haven't fully adopted it, but there's going to be an increase in one of these at least in this year, if it hasn't happened already. When we did the survey in December, it was kind of still in the draft process. So the policy comes down to a lot of the discussion too.
So Kevin and Will, I have a question. There was a mention of how many broadband or fiber attachments we have on our system in one of those slides. So is it the intent that we'll kind of charge ourselves for our fiber attachments, at least for like an accounting thing, where the broadband, is that something that we're going to do, or how does that work?
So right now, we will keep track of the broadband fiber attachments, but we have to remember in most of the bundles of the broadband, there are our SCADA systems running in the same fiber bundle. So it becomes a trickier question, just are we charging ourselves? We will keep track because we have some just strictly SCADA fiber out there and then some broadband.
Because I suppose there's an argument that the ones that are strictly broadband, that maybe that should be considered as part of the charge to the customers for the broadband system. Okay. Then I had one other question, or more of a statement. And Matt, I assume that somewhere in your analysis, you have like, here's what it roughly costs the PUD to maintain its poles each year, something like that. Do you have that rough number?
Yeah, let me grab it for you here. And these numbers are based on 2022 actuals.
Sure.
So our estimation of or operating and maintenance of overhead lines and poles is $1.9 million in 2022.
Okay. And then I guess when we think about it, we're having, so we had, I can't remember what your number was of our revenue for last year was like 286,000
Mhm.
was what we're currently getting with current rates. And then there might be a little bit that would come in from broadband once we get that all settled out. And then I guess the rest of it is paid for by our electric customers, right? That's how we cover it. Okay. Other questions?
Yeah, I'm gonna follow up on that. If I remember the slide, it seems like the assessment was about 1/10 of the attachments or hours at present. You know, again, coming back to the electric subsidizing, or even the broadband, PUD broadband customers subsidizing, it shouldn't matter whether it's a PUD broadband customer or an outside carrier that's paying those fees. Electric in particular should not be subsidizing the telecommunication side of things. And no one should be getting a break, whether it's the PUD or it should be consistent. Everybody should be treated the same, because a lot of those costs for our SCADA, I would argue, are already included in our electric rates. I think we probably already blend that in some way into either our base rate or our, our consumption fee rate or whatever it may be. So again, I don't want to get into this thing of electric subsidizing, outside suppliers.
Okay.
Yeah, when I.
So
talk-
there's another side to this question, and I think that this is more of a Kevin question. Were we to adopt the $32 rate, Kevin, what do you think the implications of that are? What impact would it have on the ISPs and other users of our poles? But I think it's primarily the ISPs.
With the $32, in the past, I believe it would have slowed down broadband in Jefferson County. And that's part of the argument to keep the rates low. Because we at Jefferson are building out an open access network, I don't believe that's the same case anymore. Because now we're hoping that there's not the overbuild and some of those things that will always happen, because you have to get from point A to point B. I don't think the pole attachment is as big a deal as it was, say, 3 or 4 years ago when we weren't building out. I think it's a cost we do need to look at, and we do need to recover our costs. We're changing out multiple poles. In 2023, we changed out considerably more poles than we did in 22. In 24, we will change out many more poles than we did in 23. Ours is an aging infrastructure. So this helps the electrical division change out poles and do the necessary maintenance we need to.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions from the commissioners? At this point, do we have any questions from anybody online? Everybody in the room is staff.
Well, I will follow. Is that the end of the presentation?
I think, oh, it looks like,
Joel has a hand.
yeah, it looks like, Matt, you said you're done?
I am, yes.
Okay, Joel.
Hi, I had a question about, back on a slide, you had our max rate at 32. And I'm just wondering if you had, and then on the slide before that where you show everybody's actual rate, do you have any information that shows the potential max rate that's reasonable that you've calculated versus the actual rate applied by a utility? So in other words, the differential, I'm just wondering if there's any wisdom that we could draw from what other utilities are doing, vis-a-vis their, we've got our current rate 22.45, max rate at 32. I'm assuming Chelan and Mason, that's just their published rate, but do you guys do a lot of work for other utilities, so I'm just wondering if you have any wisdom on that.
Yeah, if I can house my response as wisdom as opposed to quantitative analysis, because,
However you want to,
Yeah.
man, I'm fine
we
with
don't work with every one of these utilities,
Mhm.
but if I can speak with my experience working with the ones that we have worked with, I would say it's generally more common than not for us to produce these cost rate results and then for the PUDs to adopt a rate lower than the 6 rate. And that's based on my experience on the utilities that we have worked with. It's not meant to be a universal observation.
And
Thank-
when we were surveying the information, some utilities actually were nice enough to provide the formulas, how they calculated, and some just provided the number. So some of these are set at their calculated number. Without getting into details, I'm not sure if everybody has fully transitioned to the new formula as well, so we can't speak to that besides the ones we've calculated. Just because not everybody revisits the formula every time either. So just we've seen a couple of these, and some of them have been set at cost, but a few we just don't have the information on it.
So my final thoughts on this is good information, but this chart really is kind of irrelevant at the end of the day. We've heard it today that each individual utility is different for different reasons, whether it's policy or debt, the debt that they're willing to take on, maintenance programs that they're under. We bought an aging infrastructure 11 years ago, and whatever the pole attachment fees were at that time under PSE are irrelevant. It's where are we now after 11 years? Where's our infrastructure at? What needs to happen in, we'll say the next 5 years, we'll just say short term. And we've kind of, in a way, given a free ride to a lot of people for the last 11 years. And in my opinion, we need to stop doing that now, especially broadband is shining a bigger light on it. And there's money to do, broadband as part of this restoration or maintenance or upgrading, whatever terms you want to use. And we should be charging the full allowed amount at this point moving forward. That's kind of my 2 cents on it.
Okay, and I'll just throw in, I think it's a useful slide from my perspective. It shows that even if we went to the maximum amount, we're not the highest. But I kind of share, Dan, your concern about recovering as much as we can, because whatever we don't recover, guess who's paying for it? It's our electric customers, most of whom are residential, a lot of whom are lower income. So we're allowed to charge a certain rate to who are basically commercial telecommunications customers. We'll look at what we should be charging ourselves and our, customers through broadband. That'll be something we will do. But 1.9 million, when you take that compared to our total budget, that's significant. We have a significant cost every year that goes to maintain our poles. If we don't have poles, we're out of business, so we have to keep this and maintain them in a high state, and they're always in danger from fires and, knock on wood, other stuff. So
And revenue hasn't been trending well, and the last thing we want to do is raise rates to our residential customers.
somebody's going to pay. So it's a question of fairness and who should pay. Okay. I think this has been a really excellent presentation. Joel, another question.
I'm sorry, and it's a smaller question, but you guys had broken out the differential in costs between your earlier study and this study. And yeah, so if you look at this gross investment per pole, the difference is $11.25 between 2020 and 2023. Do you have a sense about what other, is that a pretty consistent difference? Can it break down that way, or does it just depend on each utility, how many poles they're replacing and the like? Just to get a sense if that's,
Yeah.
above, anyway, that's my question. Thanks.
Yeah, if I need to get a subscription to GPT, so I can answer these types of questions. The AI here. I would say that in the trend of, we would expect the dollar amount to increase. The level of increase is tough to generalize because it really depends on the capital improvement programs for each utility and how much they're devoting on an annual basis to pole replacements. So,
Okay.
I'm sorry, it's not a.
No,
a
just
satisfying
wondering if
answer.
you had it. Thanks.
Not everybody's using the same kind of poles or the same source or might have fire protection on them. This is our cost.
What does Jefferson PUD need to do?
Yeah,
That's what this
exactly.
really comes down to. It's
Exactly.
not about what Chelan or Clickitat or whoever needs to do.
Right. Okay, the last chance for any public questions on the presentation. And will this presentation be available on the website for folks who may have come late or missed it?
After the meeting, it will be.
Okay, thank you. I'm not seeing any hands. Well, what are the next steps?
So next steps, you've seen the presentation. Staff would like to bring a resolution back to the first meeting in February with a dollar amount so that we can have a signed resolution for all pole attachments in 2024 are going to be X dollars.
Okay, so it sounds like it would be appropriate now if we at least had a little discussion on where we think they ought to be. And I am totally comfortable that if we're like, hey, this is my first look at this, I need to think about this a little bit, but let's see where the commission wants to go.
Well, I'm already on the record. $32 is just fine by me. I'm ready for the resolution. I was 2 years ago. Going to the
Okay.
max then. When
Okay,
it was 23 or 24 then.
okay, thanks, Dan. How about you, Ken?
Well, given Kevin's response to my question about the implications of this, I would be in favor of phasing it in to allow time for the PUD to build out its fiber network and allow for the open access use. We've had a pattern of phasing in rate increases. And I think if we reach the $32 within a 2-year period of time, I'd be really comfortable with that.
Okay, and so if we were to do like a first year of, say, like 28 and a second year of 32, would that be kind of in the range of what you're thinking, Ken?
Exactly.
Okay. The interesting thing to me is to think about, I mean, just look at the rate study, what happened. You know, the 2020, they said 33 something, and then this year it came down to 32. And maybe that's only an anomaly of the data, you know, that long-term, because costs going up, that long-term, you know, the rates will probably go up. But anyway, I think I'd be comfortable with that approach too. And I guess, Dan, it gets us to the full cost in year 2.
We've been phasing in for 11 years. We've always been behind the curve. We're not recovering cost. At some point, phasing in, we can keep chasing that forever.
Yeah.
People have gotten a long stretch here of not keeping up with what other utilities have been charging. I will call it, I don't know what to call it, a benefit, I guess. And that's been falling on our ratepayers to cover that differential. I think that time has ended. I don't think phasing at this point is justified. We need to be charging what our cost of service to keep those poles in operation and hang those things on our poles costs. It's just that simple to me.
Okay. Well, you're on the record, and you were very clear. So I guess what I would like to see is a resolution as you described. I would like to see it with a 2-year step up, year 1 of 28, year 2 of, you know, 32 or whatever, 32 and change, whatever that was. And I would like it to be on new business so that we can have a discussion. I don't think it should go on consent. I think we should have another chance to, you know, think about this and fully discuss at the next meeting. Is that okay with both commissioners with that process?
Yeah.
I'm fine. Yes.
Won't change. I
Understood.
can let you know that now.
Understood. You will not be moved. I got it. Okay. So is that clear direction for staff?
Yeah.
Okay. So back to agenda time. Give me a second here. I apologize.
Have another portion of the.
Yeah.
Oh, we're not done?
No, this is now the excitement's just gonna begin.
Feeling so good.
That was just an appetizer.
Okay, what's next?
So go on.
The second part first.
That's
Don't
right.
tell me that was the easy part.
No. For today, this is gonna be the easier parts. This is
Okay.
just gonna be just a relaxed reminder, refresher in terms of what goes into a study such as this one that we're gonna be undertaking. Now, I think Matt's gonna jump off. If you do have any additional questions for poll attachments, I can pass them along as well. So thank you, Matt.
Yeah,
So
there you are.
for the second part of the presentation, again, we're going to focus on the upcoming rate study that we'll be performing for the electric water divisions, and actually we're going to bring in the telecom utility as well on the component of the analysis. Just as a quick heads up, I know some of you will be attending Washington PUD Association meeting tomorrow, which will have a rate setting fundamentals discussion, and this will have some of the similar content, so you'll be experts by the time that you get to that presentation. You'll be able to stand up in front instead of me and be able to give a portion of it then as well at the time.
You have extreme confidence in your students.
Well, it's going to be great.
Don't count on that.
Thanks for letting me know I can skip the presentation
Oh.
tomorrow.
Well, it's not everything. There's going to be little gems scattered throughout. So there's bonus points if you
Like we're
stay.
super smart.
Yeah. Well, so just to start out the discussion, we always like to kind of bring up this kind of a technical process graphic that reminds us in terms of the key analytical steps that go into a comprehensive cost of service study, which we'll be doing for, as I mentioned, electric and water utilities. And I'll be keeping things very high level today. So if I'm going too fast, do let me know. These steps usually have to be performed sequentially. In step one, we go through the analysis for every utility and identify our overall needs. At this point, we're strictly focusing on a multi-year plan and seeing can our rates meet those expenditures, and if not, what do we need to do about it? Step number two is where we dive a little bit deeper and look at interclass cost allocation to see if cost differences exist to provide service to different type of classes. So this step is particularly, we spent a bit of time last time around. If we had several meetings and presentations, because there are questions that can come up from it, and it's a pretty detailed analysis, gets into the weeds a little bit. So we definitely want to make sure it makes sense this time around, and if there's areas that we need to explain or elaborate on, we can definitely do that as we go through the study. And finally, step number three, this is where we actually develop the fixed and variable charges. We'll do a quick refresher once we get into each one of these steps in a bit more details what we actually did last time. So we'll give you a quick reminder. This is the strategy we adopted. These are the changes to structures that we did last time as we go through the presentation. So we'll start a discussion on the revenue requirement. Here, just high level, what is it? It's a comparison of rates to that you're assessing today to your ongoing obligations. We really want to make sure, as I mentioned on the prior slide, that we're not just looking at our base year, test year. We are still assessing a multi-year perspective, just because we do know we have costs on the horizon. Some are from regulation, some are more policy objectives, other capital related. So we never want to just focus on 1 year at a time, and to give us options on how to address our needs in the future. Now, looking at the revenue requirement, usually can summarize them to 5 different elements, key elements, which we'll quickly go over. We definitely want to revisit our financial policies, especially the last couple of years. There's been a lot of cost pressures that we've been seeing, a lot of volatility in the power market, in the cost inflation market. So here, we just want to make sure and see, as we go through the study, if our policies today are still appropriate, and put a value to them if we want to change them. We want to forecast our revenues under current levels, and then forecast expenses, making sure we're capturing O&M, capital, and debt service to get to our revenue requirement. Now, doing a quick reminder, the last time around, on this slide, you'll see some of the key policies that were incorporated into the analysis and were held constant through all utilities. The first one was a working capital reserve, was meant to act as a liquidity cushion for those fluctuations of revenues coming in and expenses coming out. And it was the target for this reserve was about 90 days of O&M. You do have access to a line of credit that can help you meet this reserve target in an emergency. And when we were working through the scenarios, we looked at alternatives where we don't utilize the line of credit versus smoothing in rate increases and impacts, by utilizing the line of credit. So that's definitely a topic that we can revisit once we dive into the study. Do we want to be only targeting 90 days, or do we still want that flexibility with that line of credit to meet the scenarios that we come up with? The second one is a capital contingency reserve, and it's really meant to help you with any cost overruns, unanticipated repairs, or slight inflationary costs. A good example would be if you have a DOT project for the water side that you weren't planning on in the list, but you know that DOT is going to be doing some work. You want to utilize and avoid kind of digging up brand new road and pavement, so you might add a project here. So this reserve can be a good use for that utility in that sense. And the reserve that we have held has been about 50% of annual capital. Overall, if you think about cash from just pure setting these type of policies, another kind of a way to look at it is from a creditor perspective. What we've been hearing is folks should have about 120 at a minimum combined reserves on hand, up to 200 days and above. So that's something we may want to look at as well if we're planning to go to the bond market ever in the next update horizon 2. Finally, the third policy we're going to be evaluating is debt service coverage and time interest earns ratios. These are basically requirements with specific loans and obligations. Bonds usually have covenants written to include coverage requirement testing. And all it is a comparison of your revenues and expenses. The net difference, the income, has to be large enough to not only cover the debt service itself, but also generate a cushion. And usually the covenant cushion is about 25% of the payment itself. So it's just giving these creditors assurances that you can not only meet the payment, but exceed it to make them comfortable to loan you out money. So one item to talk about that we can as we get into the study is, are these policies still working? Do we need to look at adding additional policies or not? Now, a couple of items to consider when developing the requirement. As we did last time, we want to look at historical patterns from our load and demand variations for both water and electric utilities. Especially on the water side, we did go through a couple of hot years. If I look back on data for our region, 2019 and 20 were pretty mild years, more average or a little below average years from a weather perspective. We got into 21, 22. The summers were fairly hot, at least from the statistics that I've seen from other utilities, and there's a lot more revenues generated. So we want to take a look at what have been seeing in 23 in comparison, and what are we comfortable with forecasting, because it can have a significant impact on our revenue view into the future.
And Sergey, I'm just going to stop you there for a second. Love that sub-bullet, consider normalizing for weather impacts. If you were able to do that, you'd be the smartest guy in the world. We're going into crazy weather times, you know, just climate change and everything else. It's just, I think it's challenging, but I get it. We got to have something in there for the equation.
Right. Yeah. And the hard part with averages is that, you know, average is just a combination of multiple years, and every year is going to be a most likely above or below average. So it's very challenging to say, here's the average that we're going to perform when we know some years are going to be below average and some years are going to be above average. So that's why having those reserves set appropriately that will help us, you know, mitigate the years that were below average and replenish those reserves when we're above, hopefully. But for sure,
we have to be able to operate our utility in a, you know, in a positive manner with fluctuations that are going to occur. Thank you.
And I'm going to pollinate on this one. There's another reason why we need to maximize other revenue streams, because of the inconsistency, and our revenue patterns are trending downward, not upward. So relating back to our last discussion on pole attachments.
Right. That's kind of the next bullet. It's important to consider all your fees and charges, including non-rate revenues, which can be delinquent fees. It could be pole attachment fees for the electric utility connection charges, which I know that the PUD has been revisiting earlier last year or last year as well. So you have been doing a great job by investigating all the alternative sources that you may have available at your disposal. Any kind of wheeling charges, we definitely want to make sure we're incorporating them and assessing them to make sure that rates are not the only source we're trying to utilize to meet our expenses. Now, one item to note is that we don't want to rely on beginning balances or one-time sources. Sometimes And that's kind of the issue of looking at things at 1 year. If we include beginning balances as a resource, it might look like we're doing great, but that resource is only there for 1 year. If we fully utilize it to avoid a rate increase, we might have a significant adjustment coming in the next year. So what we like to do is use it to smooth out adjustments over time instead of just relying it in 1 year and assuming it's going to be there again in the future.
And Sergey, kind of on that note too, we had the benefit last year of the redistribution clause from BPA, and we got some credit there that shows up to us as money we didn't have to spend, and that's again going to happen at a lesser level in 2024. So you guys are aware of those as far as it looks on our balance sheets, correct?
Yep. Yeah. We've been following those announcements by Bonneville, and there's a couple approaches that we can take and that we have done with other utilities. Some folks like to be conservative and like to avoid including those as a resource. They basically put it into the fund balances to help them for future times. So that's definitely an option. We don't want to rely on it as a reduction of power cost. That's one alternative. Others have partially utilized it to smooth out rates in the front end and then push it into the future to avoid future adjustments. So there's definitely multiple approaches that we can do with this upcoming redistribution clause. I believe they delayed. Bonneville just announced the final decision, which delayed it by a month or so, but they'll be doing it for both power and transmission. So when we get into the modeling, we'll definitely capture this and have options for you to consider.
And those are examples of one-time benefits that are probably going to sunset. I don't know that we're going to see that benefit in the years to come.
Right, it's going to be definitely tricky because the Bonneville is going through, as I'm sure you're aware of, the contract renegotiations for 2028 time period, and who knows what kind of provisions that they're going to be having and changes in that contract when it's finalized.
Well, I don't know how the other commissioners feel about that item because it's a big, it was kind of a big number last couple of years in terms of giving FCS feedback on it. My personal feeling, looking at what's happened up until now with the snowpack, it's been terrible. And I think my preference with our revenue, our cash reserves being below where I'd like them to be. And now you're saying that, hey, the market's saying 90 days isn't really satisfactory. It ought to be 120 to 200. I think it's nice to have that number shown of what, Bonneville may credit us, but frankly, I'd rather not be, reducing our actual costs by that number, because I think it sends a false message to our customers that, oh, we're going to get, X millions back from BPA every year. I don't think that's going to be the case at all. And I would like to, rather use that money into the cash reserves and have the rates based on actual costs and actual rates, and not consider that temporarily reduced BPA cost as something more permanent than it really is. It's speculative, frankly.
Yeah, I just want to make sure how Sergey was going to approach it.
Yeah. So Ken, do you have any thoughts on how you'd like to see those numbers used?
Some years.
Oh, I think you froze on us. Give you a second, see if you come out of it.
I agree with you. It's really speculative and not something that can be counted on except on a year-by-year basis.
Yeah, in our financial and risk management policy, we have some guidelines in there for our reserves and those sorts of things. We can go by. Matter of fact, I think we're due for a meeting to review that policy and the strategic plan. I personally don't have a problem with putting into reserves, but the way things are going, I could see giving the managers some leeway, depending on what that equation is for what we are supposed to carry by policy, to have it for capital improvement. I think that's the secondary with what we're looking at. We're going to need some money for capital improvement programs, and maybe that's where some of that money should go.
Well, either way. So I guess I'll just sum up. Either way, what I'm hearing is the commissioners would, it's nice to see the numbers, but we'd prefer to have the rates based on the actual cost of running the utility, and whatever that BPA money is, have it either be reinvested back in the utility or in cash reserves, not as a basis for rate reduction, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. That's great. It's great. And we'll definitely give you alternatives as we dive into the numbers, just to give you a quantitative impact.
Okay, and Don's got his hand up. Don?
So one of the other balance points in this thing is what is the capability of your rate base to pay whatever you charge? And one of the things that I think is important to take a look at as well after all these calculations are completed is what's the economic condition in Jefferson County, median incomes, unemployment rates. That will help, at least in a subjective way, to give the commissioners an idea of what the capability are of the rate base to pay whatever rate you set in place after the study's completed.
Well, I would translate that to don't count your chickens before they're hatched. So let's see where the numbers fall, and we might feel differently if the study says, oh yeah, you need a 9% rate increase to cover everything. So it's
Right.
a good point, Don. Thank you. All right, Sergey.
All right. And we can always revisit some of these slides as well. So if you have any other great insight on them, just let me know and we can go back. So the next item to consider are costs, and we like to encourage folks, and for ourselves, for modeling, to separate your costs into types. One type of cost is usually tracked as an operating cost, which these type of costs are fairly regular. They don't really go away. They do change with the cost of inflation, the cost of power, the maintenance, but really they're fairly consistent besides kind of an annual modification, maybe some changes in staffing levels if we're adding staff or modifying staffing positions. So, and it's always a good idea to have a good understanding what that component of our revenue requirement is made up of. And then we separate out capital expenditures because they're fairly irregular. You might have big years of projects. You have a substation project or a storage tank project that goes by. It's done in 1 or 2 years. And then you might have more renewal and replacements for a couple of years. So there's a lot of variability in capital. The reason why we like to do that as well is because it does give you more flexibility in scenario development. If we have a full comprehensive plan of projects, and we know that we have a list of ranked order projects from critical projects, moderate to low risk projects, we may be able to look at modifying schedules, kind of working with your staff and engineering staff to see, can we modify the timing where we only include the critical projects on the front end, and the low risk projects may be pushed out a couple of years to give us an ability to phase in a rate strategy instead of having all front loaded, let's say, if the system planning documents indicated. So gives you more flexibility to assess impacts to your customers.
Well, and one nice thing about having you working with us again, Sergey, is I think you're getting a sense of our culture and what we're kind of most comfortable with our business practices and investing and sending signals on rates. So just hearing from what you're saying, you're getting us as a utility. So I appreciate that.
Great. So a couple of cost items to consider when planning for both operating and capital items. It's definitely important to look at historicals, but as the last 2 years at least taught me a little bit of a lesson, that historical inflation is not always representative of what we're going to see. You know, we weren't expecting a 10% inflationary rate 2 years ago. So that occurred 2 years ago. So it's always a good idea to have a finger on the pulse, so to speak, on these metrics, because as you mentioned earlier, we are forecasting, we're making assumptions, and if some of these assumptions deviate substantially, that's a great time to come in, revisit, and see if we need to make some modifications. Now, when we are developing these type of plans, it's important that as we go through this, we account for any initiatives or staffing needs that we may not include in our budgets. So an example would be talking to a lot of utilities right now through our studies. We're finding that there's a lot of shortages in staff. There's a lot of retirements that happen, transitions that happen, and utilities are just running lean, and their staff they just don't have the staffing needs that they can't. So there's a lot of movement for utilities to get back to full utilization levels over time. Well, if we use the budget as our baseline, which is maybe 5 staff down, depending on your staffing levels, that's a totally different picture than if we were fully utilized, and vice versa. If we're planning for fully staffed budget, but we know we never have hit full utilization ever in the past, that's a different rate impact. So that's something we definitely want to keep in mind. Also, with a lot of the grid modernization and regulation that we're getting in place, some utilities are looking at initiatives and pilot programs. Different deployment of smart meters or time of use meters to track EVs. Certain pilot programs for demand response. All these things cost money, and if we are looking into that, that's something we should also consider including in our forecast. So just more about not just relying on strictly budget, but also what are we planning on the horizon, other staff changes that need to happen, and are there initiatives that need to be captured in the future projections too?
Hey, Sergey, you brought up something that
Mhm.
other utilities are dealing with, and that's meter replacement, meter upgrade programs. Kevin, could you just give us a reminder where we're at in terms of, so we borrowed money, correct, to pay for our meter replacement program. So that means we're going to have a period of years where we're going to be paying that back. So yeah, so I guess we're through that process. We've made that decision, and now that number is a very predictable number over the future that they can plug into rates. But we shouldn't be looking at, say, unknown additional costs on meters, because it seems like it's working. We're rolling it out. Everything's going as per plan. Would that be correct statement? Okay, so we kind of locked those costs in for
On
now.
the electrical side,
Okay.
we'll look at some changes on the water side.
But that would be, fewer customers shouldn't have the kinds of impact. Okay. All right. Thank you for letting me just ask that. Please continue, Sergey.
Yep. And then the capital cost consideration that we want to keep in mind is the funding strategy. How do we fund our costs? There's just really three ways to do it. Cash basis, pay-as-you-go approach, where we pretty much pay everything out of rates. Here we really want to be careful and have a mindful strategy, save up money over time if possible. It's very challenging if we have a unanticipated project that's fairly large come in. It would require a significant rate increase because it's basically putting all the pressure on current customers. And I know that we had a discussion last time around for the electric utility specifically, that we did have already quite a bit of debt incurred for the purchase of the utility for about 12 years ago now, or 11 years ago now. So we wanted to keep a mindful approach with the use of debt, because we're fairly leveraged from that process. So that'll be another discussion that we'll definitely want to have as we get into the capital program and the updated costs. A second option is to use debt, which can help you smooth out action if we have capacity. So it can mitigate rates on the front end, but if we use too much of it, it can help us get into more costs. So we may have more costs. The benefit of debt, as always, is to align that how costs are incurred versus the life of the asset, and then allow more customers to come in to help contribute to the payment of that asset. So kind of that intergenerational equity, so to speak. If there's assets that are long-lived and bring capacity to not just current customers, it's a good idea to spread them through more customers in the future. And the hybrid approach, which takes a rational approach for funding some projects through renewal and replacements, as an example, through cash, and capacity enhancing projects such as substations through debt. So there's alternatives how to do it, but really there's three ways to fund your capital program. And then once you get all the pieces together, we do perform a sufficiency test. Right now I'm just showing the cash and coverage. We also do a tier type sufficiency test. Some folks like to look at leverage. So as we look at revisiting your financial policies through the study, we may include some additional sufficiency testing to make sure we can hit and comply with all the policy requirements of the PUD. Now, just a quick reminder in terms of what was the findings from last time. When we did the study in 2020, we did identify a multi-year plan. For the electric division, we were at about 4% in 2021 and a slightly higher adjustment of 4.25% per year in 22 through 2024. That, of course, was before we got into the inflationary period. So, but Bonneville Power Administration initially had lower increases than we anticipated. We'll have to take a look at the forecast for your system in terms of how are you doing in your tier 1 threshold. I haven't had a chance to take a look at that yet. If we are dipping into that tier 2 above rate high watermark purchases, because as probably you're aware of, tier 2 and market prices have just been skyrocketing since last October. With the beginning of the federal fiscal year of 2024, short-term tier 2 rates went up from $33, $34 per megawatt hour to $64, $65, so almost doubled. So market purchases are high, and for those utilities that are getting new large loads, those utilities that are exceeding their tier one allocation, they're definitely going to be feeling a huge pressure from that above rate high water mark purchase levels.
So Sergey, Commissioner Tupper, so
Uh-huh.
board discussed this or managers discussed this. Are we going to go after another 4-year rate term? Are we looking longer to a 6-year or 5-year term? Because I know BP 24 was settled, correct?
That's correct. 24 is already underway.
Is it going to be 3 years on that rate case?
Preliminary discussions, and again, I'm not privy to some of the extra discussions that the utilities get, but I believe that the preliminary indication is it may be a 3 years term for the next.
So we're going to be looking out either way, whether it's 4-year, 5-year, 6-year, beyond the rate case in 24. And to Jeff's comments earlier about the snowpack and different things and how we're going to get our power and whether it's tier 1 or tier 2, how are you going to deal with that, 4th and possibly 5th or 6th year in this study that you're going to do for us?
Right. So we definitely have the capability to look out more years. I think that the analytical modeling tool that we have available was set up for a 10-year plan. We can make it longer, but the further out you go, especially with Bonneville right now, it's just more uncertainty you get and the more deviation potential. So hopefully Bonneville will give us a little bit more information for the years beyond this next couple of rate setting period as we engage this process, as they have more meetings. But the ability to run some of the sensitivities, looking at various levels of price adjustments for cost of power, will give us more sensitivities. So we'll have to definitely have a discussion on risk management when we get into the discussion of scenarios about what's going to happen in 3 years. Do we want to have a conservative outlook? Do we want to have more consistent outlook? Theoretically speaking, Bonneville has been deferring rate adjustments on their tier 1 prices for a while, several rate periods. They tried to keep them steady, at least for power. Transmission has gone up close to double digit several times, but that's a smaller portion of the overall rate. So there's definitely options we can look at when we dive into the presentation, to the analysis.
Thanks, Sergey.
And Sergey, you just packed a lot of verbal description in that slide, and about 50% went flying past me. So and to Dan's point too, when we adopt a multi-year rate case adjustment, whatever, if we get to that 2nd or 3rd or 4th or whatever year and things have changed, we have the ability to change those because they're an estimate. But what I heard you say was a lot of utilities. Did you say that kind of now and going backwards in the last couple of years, a lot of utilities are finding themselves over their tier 1 allocation, and the tier 2 costs were a lot higher than they anticipated? So in looking forward in their rate cases, they're having to significantly increase rates. Is that what you were saying?
Right. So quite a few utilities, we're at the threshold or we're already above the threshold, and we're purchasing above rate high watermark products either through Bonneville or through a non-federal source. As CETA came out, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which required transition to the clean energy by 2045 kind of timelines, and with intermediaries check-in points, a lot of utilities, at least in our region, decided to go primarily with Bonneville. So most utilities that I'm familiar with transitioned away if they had above rate high watermark needs, went to Bonneville for the short-term product. Now, the question of are they having increases? That depends what portion of their overall power profile that is above rate high watermark, right? If it's only 10%, even though the increase was 50, it's only 10% of their power cost. And power costs are not the only cost they have. So they're not having significant skyrocket increases, but they are having a lot of pressure. And many utilities that are just now getting into the above rate high watermark territory because they have a new large load that joined the system, those are the ones that are having to go through some tough discussions in terms of how do we implement it, who should pay for it, and they may be experiencing some increases.
Okay, and Sergey, when you give us our formal numbers and presentation recommendations, are you planning? Can you spend? I guess, do you have the information to spend any time talking about where we're at in terms of tier 1 and what our exposure is and how long we have, or what our exposure to tier 2 or other issues could be? Is that something you're going to cover?
Not today. I haven't had a chance to get that information. Yep, for sure.
going forward when you get to the actual real numbers and.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I think one of the discussions and most likely our first meeting, once we had a initial result, kind of results for the revenue requirement, focusing on the revenue requirement, we'll talk about our load forecast, because a big component of your need for tier 2 power is the review of what's your load profile like. Are we anticipating any expansion and growth in specific sectors? Are you seeing any interest in new large loads joining? Because if that happens, that changes the load profile. So we'll definitely cover and discuss how far away we are, if we're and where we are with our tier 1 allocation.
Okay, and Ken, you have your hand up?
I do. So I would be interested in knowing what the revenue requirement on the water side is minus the sewer utility. And separately, because this is a live issue for folks in Beckett Point, to see a little bit more detailed breakdown of the costs related specific to the sewer utility. I think because, again, we're in discussions with customers, it'll be useful to have updated information.
Well, I'm just wondering too, if it was planned to cover electric, water, and sewer all in the same meeting, I'm kind of thinking, I wonder if we should break them out, because it's going to be a lot to digest. Just thinking about the electric side, I wonder if we could have separate sessions for what does the commission think? Do you feel the same way as I do, that I think the water and the sewer is going to be a substantial conversation piece by itself, Mike?
I just want to touch bases on something Ken just mentioned. I actually told Sergey for today's meeting, because we did have originally, when I met with Sergey going over the presentation, that we were going to do track the sewer utility as a separate entity. But for today's presentation, I said, go ahead and put it in there also, partly because I wanted the discussion to see how we wanted to handle it, whether we want to handle it as a separate.
Yeah.
That's kind of what we talked about last time, but for today's presentation, I told Sergey just to go ahead and keep it in.
Yeah.
As water, and then that way we can.
Yeah. So commissioners, we agree that we should be heading with the sewer starting to peel off and develop its own numbers. Okay. And then you're also, Kevin, are you okay with that in terms of structure of your meetings? If we have the electric stuff happen one meeting and then the water and the sewer stuff happen in a different one, is that okay? Cool.
What about broadband, for setting the rates on that for cost of service? Is that included in this study? Are we gonna roll, fold broadband into this too?
So at this point, the discussion for electric would be, for telecom and broadband would be from a revenue requirement perspective. We're gonna look at if you're covering its needs. The tricky part, especially as you're building out the system with the telecom utility, is that unlike water, sewer, electric utility, where you're the only provider in the area, there's other providers for broadband, and it becomes a little bit more of a market discussion too. So it becomes a little bit of a balancing act, because if you do need to cover your costs, but they're above market cost, it could change things quite a bit. So because it's such a new utility and it's still being built out, we're just focusing on the cost to provide, the revenue requirement aspect of it. We're not diving into inter-class residential or commercial business type of a connection or anything like that.
And just to get back to my point too, I think we'll have a meeting where all this stuff converges, when we'll have all the conclusions and we can digest them all at once and make decisions. But I'm just afraid our heads might blow up, or at least mine might blow up, if we try to do all this in one meeting, because it's a lot to think about, and they're kind of different business lines. And I think at least I want to have my head in the right place to really be thinking and comprehensively about each one, and ask the right questions and make sure we're tasking you folks with the kind of work, so that when we're done, we're happy with where we land.
Yep.
Yeah,
I
Mike.
just want to double check and make sure, because I know the meeting's only till noon and we're only about halfway through the slides here. Do we have a hard stop at noon? Or
And Ken, do you have a hard stop at noon? I don't.
want to make sure, because I know we still got 2 executive sessions, so before Sergey gets going too much.
Yeah. Ken, how are you today?
Yeah, I don't have a hard stop at noon. I can continue for perhaps half an hour.
Okay. How are we doing with your time there, Sergey? How far are we through your presentation?
I'm pretty good. We have a couple more slides to go. They're again educational content, many of it, so I can go fairly quick. But
Yeah,
I do want to give you the opportunity to ask questions because again, I want to make sure that everything's making sense. So just let me know the pacing. I can speed it up. As you remember, I'm a fast talker sometimes.
yeah, I guess when it's review, you can speed up. If you've got something new, maybe slow down.
All right. So just this is just a reminder slide, and these are great notes. We did plan for again an educational process, so we'll definitely use several meetings to bring up these topics and discussions as we go. So now we'll switch gears and talk about cost of service. This is going to be probably pretty quickly. We're going to go through this information. I know last time, as I mentioned before, this was a new topic. It's definitely confusing for most folks if they have not been through the study. But just to start reintroducing it, again, the main thing we're trying to identify here is, do cost differences exist to serve other classes? So does it cost more for residential than commercial? As well as we were able to identify cost-based unit costs. What does it cost us to serve these customers from a dollars per month perspective, dollars per kilowatt hour, per CCF, per gallon, and so on. So this gives us a really great starting point for rate design. Another visual example of why this is important is kind of to make sure that we're equitable when we're charging our customers. If we have some customers that are served off of, let's say, transmission level service, they shouldn't be paying for distribution because they're not utilizing that network. If they are distribution customers and they're primary only, like you have two classes of service that are primary customers, they don't have secondary or they don't utilize the PUD's secondary infrastructure. So we want to be equitable or fair, in some folks like to say, and not assess them a fee for their secondary transformers because they have and own and replace their own secondary infrastructure. Now, to perform the analysis, we usually go through 3 steps as well. It's all about grouping costs into common cost pools. Are they related to production or supply for water, transmission of the electricity to our distribution system, and distributing it? On the water side, you might look at things like storage and pumping. We'll then align our costs into cost pools, basically creating a nexus between the function or activity performed and the data that is used to measure that activity. So it could be demand or peaking, energy or average usage for water, and fixed costs like customer costs. We'll get into that when we talk about the presentation itself, when we get to that point of the analysis. And then finally, developing allocation factors, which is basically taking your statistics, number of accounts, energy used, peaking factors, and so on to allocate these cost pools. I know it sounds a little bit probably complicated, but hopefully we'll be able to provide more context with some numbers when we get into the presentations. Just to give you a little bit more context, I'll be going quick. What is functionalization? Again, it's simply taking your plant assets and your costs and arranging them into the functions they perform. Ideally, this is done through the utilization of uniform systems of accounts. There's usually FERC or RUS uniform systems of accounts. The reason for that is because there are methodologies used in the industry of rate making that help us allocate some of these expenses. So that's great news. And I believe looking at your numbers, I have it on my side from the past, your accounts are organized by uniform system of accounts. So we can have a consistent methodology approach from study to study where we go through and we perform a similar type of allocation without maybe we put some costs in one category, a GL code, and then we move them to a different GL code. Here, ideally, they're going to be consistent through the entire study into a different study. Once we have functionalized our cost, we go through the classification process. And it's establishing a relationship between the activity and the cost itself to help us align which statistics to use to allocate it to the customers. We'll be looking at things like energy for the electric utility, which is basically costs related to power or Bonneville. They change with the consumption usage of electricity. We're going to look at demand type costs, which are tied to the maximum rate of use. This one is always tricky to think about. Before I started doing electric studies many years ago, this was kind of a new interesting concept to conceptualize. But what we're really after here is that some customers are fairly inefficient, so we have to oversize our facilities significantly to allow them to peak, while on an average basis, they're not using the system fairly often. So in that case, we really want to make sure that we allocate at least the oversizing of those facilities appropriately to those customers, because if we had an average system, the average system would be much smaller. without having those peak requirements. And finally, we have customer costs. These are costs that don't vary with consumption. You're going to have meter reading costs if they're still around with AMI, or in that case, it's going to be billing, accounting, but also a portion of your backbone that never goes away just to get 1 unit of electricity to everybody's front door should be recovered through that fixed nature of a charge. Finally, there's the allocation process. Again, that's taking a look at your data, your number of accounts, the energy. We can look at if it's available during the study, the energy distribution by hour. We can look at demand, different types of demand, and depending on which cost pool, we would have a selection of allocation factors to spread those costs to the customers that we select as part of the analysis. So the next slide, we do have a quick refresher. I apologize if it's a little small. I can't quite tell your screens, but this is just, go ahead.
Before you move on, a quick
Yep.
question. This is for you and probably for the manager. Have we evolved or expanded to the point that we need to revisit the number of classes that we have on the electric side in particular, not so much the water, because there's only 3 classes in the water. But do we need to revisit how we're breaking out the 7 or 10, whatever classes we have? Are we going to go by the existing structure, or does that need to be reviewed?
That's a great discussion point. I think we'll be covering it during the beginning. We'll have a discussion if we're still happy. You know, a couple items to look at. We have small and large general. We may look at, is there a reason to have a medium general class of service? We may look at electric vehicle rates potentially. That could be assessed if we have data. Another item to look at is new large load rates. Do we want to pull them out? Some folks are looking at net metering rates. If you have exceeded your target levels, you may be able to actually have a net metering rate. That's a cost-based rate. So those are all the discussions that we'll have internally with your staff and maybe present to you as a consideration item.
Because I think there's some granularity there that it could matter at the end of the day on how you calculate everything out for the purposes of the rates on revenue, what the potential revenue should or could be.
Yeah, and that's definitely going to be a review of current classes will be a discussion point. Now, this slide, what you're seeing is a summary of the prior study in terms of the kind of the 2021 results. The upper left table is summarizing the electric utility. And what really are focusing in on here are the dashed lines and how each bar, which represents each class, is getting inside these dotted lines. The rationale here is that we want to be within a range of reasonableness of cost of service because every year our data changes a little bit depending on the seasonality in the economy. Our budgets change. And we are implementing a phase-in strategy from before. So if we're within those dashed range of reasonable lines, we're within cost of service. If we're outside, if the bar is higher, we're paying too much and we need to come down. If we're below, we're not paying enough and we may need to come up. So if we look at the results from last time, we did find that our electric utility, there were some interclass differences, and we did develop a very gradual phase-in just to start addressing some of the issues. Now, the hope here is that when we go through the update, we did not have any smart meters on our accounts last time. I believe the PUD is implementing smart meters right now. So maybe through the study, there will be some.
Can we use a different term?
Oh, sure.
That whole smart meter thing, it's like got all this baggage and can imply all sorts of things to some people that we're like watching what they're doing.
That's right. That's true.
I mean, it's like, what's a better term,
AMI.
Kevin? AMI meters.
AMI meters, advanced meters. Is that better?
Yes.
Is that better? Okay.
It's more
Sorry
accurate.
about that. That's true. They are called advanced metering infrastructure.
We call them smart. I think they're dumb. Let's just call them what they are. AMI.
That's right. AMI meters. So the goal is that as we get through the study going, we'll have at least a couple of months of, if not a full year, eventually through this year of data, at least for a partial subset of customers within each class, and that can really help us enhance the allocation of cost of service. And maybe with that data, we'll be able to make even more progress, or the data may show that more classes are actually doing a lot better, because we did have to make some assumptions last time around using industry practices and other neighboring utility data for behaviors to make the analysis. That's why we took a very gradual approach for cost of service. As the data is coming in from these AMI meters, might be able to enhance it and make more progress towards cost of service as well. On the water utility side, we actually found we're doing really well. You'll notice that the third class, the residential discount class, was under, but that's the whole intent, is that we are providing these customers a discount by policy, and we're allowed to do that in the state of Washington. So that the results are almost perfect right on for the major classes for the water utility. So we'll make sure that that's still happening. Next, we'll be moving on to rate design, the last step of the process. Again, as somebody who's creating rates, we're just trying to make sure that we collect the appropriate dollars identified in the first two steps. After that, we want to be passing on the cost messaging we are receiving as a utility to our customers, but also meeting the goals and objectives of the utility. So if our goal is conservation or low income support or anything else, we want to make sure that we're capturing that through our policy level discussions and rate structures. And sometimes these might counteract each other. So that's where we definitely will want to prioritize and rank what are our top objectives of the study. As I've been saying lately too, there's not really a one size fits all solution to rate design. There's not one perfect rate that will meet everybody's goals and objectives. So we really need to identify first, what are we trying to achieve with our rates, and then we can align a structure that can help us do it. If we're trying to achieve revenue sufficiency and stability, we might really focus on our fixed charges and basic charges on a monthly basis. If we're focusing on conservation, we might emphasize the energy rate a little bit more, look at additional tiers or modifying our tiers. And then at the same time, we need to make sure our rates are affordable, simple enough for folks to understand what we're trying to communicate, and defensible. So to give a brief reminder of what, I'll go ahead.
Commissioner Tupper, before you get into this slide, couple quick questions. One, we haven't really discussed low income, how we're considering to deal with low income at the current level, or if we're expecting, a higher level of low income moving forward. The state's working on programs that maybe we could be mandated into and things like that. Yet to happen, but it's on the kind of on the forefront. The other question is with the slide you just had up. You can go to the next slide. Okay. And is what's the history on the 0 to 600, 600 to 1600? Do we need to look at, because that's what we're determining our revenues on how we're charging our customers. Should that be 0 to 500 or 0 to 700? Should we be looking at changing those tiers at this point in time? I know time of use and other things are going to play into this. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's always could be a portion of discussion, the sizing of the tiers. I think that the original tiers, and please correct me if I'm wrong, came from before. This was kind of a carryover from prior rates in the past. We did add a new tier last time to try to address the conservation of 1600, and we did look at some of the peak month usage just to make sure at that time when we're looking at data, we provided enough capacity for folks for that peak month on an average basis, but still send a conservation message. So we could look at the structure of these tiers. The issue with conservation based rates and tier rates are partially policy driven, because right now you don't have kind of a 3-tier structure from Bonneville. Let's say the messaging, there's not a direct cost basis that at 600 kilowatt hours per customer you're gonna hit a certain threshold. So what we usually look at our kind of rules of thumb is that what are we trying to accomplish through these rates? So are we trying to provide our customers with a lifeline usage through tier 1? So that's what our goal. We can look at either average consumption or shoulder month average consumption, kind of what is the bare minimum usage we need for essential services. So depending that could be cooking and heating portion of the regular heating, that could be all sorts of type of options. But usually tier 1 should represent lifeline base level of usage that's available to our customers. After that, we want to take a look at how much conservation we want to have. Is it moderate? Is it high level of conservation? So there's definitely a methodology that we could look into redefining these tiers and blocks when we get into the discussion.
So before you start getting too far down the rabbit hole and running calculations or simulations or whatever it is you're going to do to determine, our revenues and what our costs should be, when should we have that discussion about these particular 3 tiers? Is it now, or is it a month from now, 6 months from now? Because I think it is important for whatever you're going to do for calculating, we have to kind of decided that this is where we want to be.
So the discussion for us, any kind of inkling that you may have, the earlier the better, I guess I would say. So if you for certain know that we're not happy with the current 3 tiers, or we want to investigate, it gives us a good enough heads up that we need to spend a little bit more time around this type of data and coming up with answers for you. So if you have comments for us anytime. We can also, bring up future topics during the initial meeting, so we can have a portion of our time when we're discussing revenue requirements that will focus on, okay, rate design will be coming up in 2 meetings. Give us an idea then of what we want to see. I just want to be conscious of your time and the 2 additional agenda items that you have coming up, but I'm available to discuss them anytime.
Yeah, because one last point is you have base rate increases, are on the table versus the consumption. So, that's the second part of the equation is what direction will the board want to go? So just
Yeah.
that's board's, information we should be thinking about.
Yeah, and I guess I don't have a basis at this point for thinking that those numbers on the tiers should fall into different categories. But I think the one thing that might be interesting, and you said it depends on when you take a look at that consumption. Is it December? Is it March? Is it September? Or is it summer? And the thing that I think is kind of interesting is if you can kind of make a bar graph across, well, when we look at 0 to 600 or, pick your slice, how many of our customers in a particular month fall into that versus the higher ones, which kind of shows, well, here's where our customers fall at different times a year. I think that kind of data is helpful then to kind of look at these tiers and say, do we feel like the tiers are right? But that's just my thought on it.
No,
You agree too?
I do.
Okay. All right. So maybe some information like that could be helpful if feel like if
Okay.
we're comfortable where they're at or elsewhere. Thanks.
Yep, so that
No, I
goes down.
think, excuse me, I think that that's a very good point because our lower income customers often have the least efficient home heating systems and would be impacted significantly in winter months if we change the rate structure. Depending on the tiers and the amount of usage. So I think your point is well taken, Commissioner Randall, that looking at it seasonally is much more important than looking at it a year at a time.
Please keep going. Oh, Tom Tiers, did you have a question that's a clarifying question, Tom?
Maybe not so much a question, but just keep in mind electric vehicles are going to create a lot more energy usage on households because we're all going to be forced to use electric vehicles in 10 years. So as you're adding higher tier structures, you're going to be basically discouraging people from adoption. And that's kind of contrary to the state's policy. So please keep that in mind. Thank you for the
and you might have
opportunity
missed
to comment.
Thank you, Tom. And you might have missed it, but one of the things Sergey said is there's this whole idea of a, electric vehicle rate. And then I think it also gets into potentially time of use rates because electric vehicles, you can program them for when they charge. So yeah, a very, very interesting angle. Please continue, Sergey.
Okay, yep, so basic charges will definitely be on the table again, once we update the cost-based unit cost for your decision in terms of the policy discussion, which way to go. On the waterfront, we did make a little bit of an adjustment on the basic fees with one of the increases and then kept the increases proportionate. The major changes we did was institute a meter-based fee for everybody. Your residential customers at that time were only paying the same fee for all meters. And I believe we moved to the direction where unless the meter is mandated for fire sprinklers, we're going to be charging folks based on meter size for all classes of service. Then we lined up the CaliPoint rates to align over a 2-year period for all classes. Doesn't matter if your CaliPoint standard rates, the same rate for everybody for water utilities. And we introduced a capital surcharge to help us with our capital improvement program for the water utility.
And can I just mention one thing too? Sometimes when you're doing, here's the rate impacts, be careful of, oh my gosh, it's going up 137%. Especially if the actual increase is like $2.
Right.
So when you're doing those analysis and those recommendations, please keep in mind if numbers look funny, also look at the dollar figure too, just as a heads up.
Okay.
And one other quick thing, I know we had FCS working on a capacity fee. Are you coordinating in-house on that?
Yeah, we'll be discussing the outcomes of those studies and incorporate the forecast as additional revenue sources into the revenue requirement as well.
Okay.
So last one here for the background is the sewer utility. We did evaluate the sewer utility from a rate design perspective. Originally, our goal was to see if we can move them to a one size standard rate for all systems. But as we got into the discussions, we had several meetings and several comments from our customers. We actually went the opposite direction, and we expanded our rates from a standard and Calipoint rate to a standard Calipoint and Beckett point rate. So that was a new introduction last time, based on the time order and expense allocation that we evaluated during that time, because your staff was tracking, is still tracking the time it takes to provide service to these specific areas. And at that point in time, it looked like there was justification to separate that one out. So that was a new addition during the last study.
Okay, and then what's not, one thing not listed on here is the Port Hadlock sewer. Is that too far out and kind of a special case, and we're not going to look at that as part of this?
So this is the background. That's definitely an item that we can add to it as
I'm
an
looking
area.
at Kevin. Kevin's shaking
Oh.
his head. I think it's a different animal.
So the rate design for Hadlock Sewer will be the county's responsibility.
So we don't want FCS. We don't want to spend money having FCS do it when the county's on it. Okay, that's it. Forget what I said, Sergey.
Okay, I didn't hear anything. It was.
I hear
That's right.
nothing.
That's right.
That's where my head went.
So a couple more slides to go through. This is where kind of, if you have some input, which you already have provided, it'll be great. This is just a summary of your current rates. There's a basic charge that scales by type of meter and type of customer. We're at $28.50 for our basic charges. If looking back, I think we identified we could be somewhere in the mid to upper 30s. This is just going by last study of the analysis, and we'll definitely be recalibrating those fees and based on latest costs. We have a uniform energy rate for all classes except energy charges for residential, which are based on the 3 tiers that we talked about. And there's a demand charge for some of the bigger commercial customer classes as well. So this time around, we're definitely going to take a look at the residential energy tiers. So we're going to look at it, provide you some background information, and have discussions about if we need to change anything or look at some statistics and how they appear. We're going to look at evaluating a cost-based advanced or AMI opt-out rate. So there's some folks that choose not to have an AMI meter. If they choose to do so, that is actually an additional expense to the PUD, because without, if everybody was an AMI, theoretically speaking, you wouldn't need meter or to go out and physically read a meter, because you can do it electronically. So if somebody has an old style meter, you'll have to still send somebody out to do the reading, which is an additional cost above everybody else. So we'll be doing that. We are planning. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, on that point, I know that we're going to have areas of the county that the AMI isn't going to be able to function properly. So we're going to have a certain level of people who will have not be on the AMI system. I think we need to be careful to distinguish how we're going to distinguish between those people versus people who are in the opt-out, because either way, we're going to roll trucks to read meters at some point. So I'd be curious to see a little granularity in what we're charging for. Is it the man hours? Is it the cost of the vehicle? Is it the cost of the type of meter? I mean, I think there needs to be granularity when we get to that discussion about why we're going to charge what we're going to charge for an opt-out.
Yep.
Okay. I have a question for Will or Kevin. I'm assuming, and I haven't looked at this myself, like what data somebody with a new AMI meter can utilize at home using whatever, software, whatever, programs that we have. And I think it'd be kind of cool to cover that sometime, not necessarily with rates, but just say, hey, once you have a new meter, or here's how, and I don't know if we're going to change it, if we're going to change what's available on our website so that people can get a better sense for when and how they're using power, so that they can, hopefully have the biggest impact on their power bill, especially for looking at time of use rates or electric vehicles. So anyway, just a thought for presentation at some point.
Real important for the time of use, the electric vehicle charges, that the customers have access to use that information.
So I think, so I think just some education, both for us and them, would be nice sometime. Okay. Next.
Great. Waterfront, on the waterfront, we're keeping things simple, original for now. That's the intent is not to make significant changes here unless there's something that you want us to address. So right now, we're just looking at across the board adjustments, because if the cost of service still comes on like we're doing well, we're just gonna apply the increases proportionally. The only thing we're gonna rebalance a little bit maybe is the capital surcharge. We're gonna have to look at the capital plan, the debt, and do it there. It looks like Commissioner Ken has a comment or question.
Yes, we had an issue with a particular customer who needed to have a 1-inch diameter pipe because the water pressure was particularly low. And this is for residential usage. So just to flag that for the future, I think we need to consider for similar situations in the future, how do we want to classify that usage, whether we should charge that individual who is residential the lower cost or maintain a strict across the board pricing, whether it's residential or commercial, if the customer has a 1-inch pipe.
Yeah, I think today's not the time to talk about it, but I agree, Ken. So when we get to water rates, if we could spend a little time talking about what is the methodology or the idea behind these large differences in charges for different size, and maybe there is an asterisk for, hey, this person's going to be just like any other residential person. They're getting a 1-inch because there's something weird about the topography or the water pressure or whatever there. So I think that's a good footnote for when we get there. So be prepared to talk about that, Sergey, why those charges are different.
Okay. And then the sewer utility, we are going to be revisiting the differentials at this point. Without diving in deeper, right now we're still planning to review the 3 systems. I don't know if there's if there's more systems that you want to look at. It does not sound like it, but we'll definitely talk to your staff internally. And if you have any questions there, that's going to be the discussion point. Is now, because there was a mention of standalone rates for sewer. Last time around, these were within the water division, so they follow the water adjustments. What could happen this time, if we look at standalone sewer, and that alone could have a pressure on everybody, depending if they're covering their costs or not. And on top of that, we would need to distribute it between systems. So if we are looking at standalone sewer rates, there's going to be 2 items that are going to be impacting the sewer rates, the overall adjustment and the system specific adjustment. So keep that in mind for future points.
Okay.
Okay, and really with that gets us to the end of the presentation. Just a preliminary schedule. We're going to be working with your staff to coordinate to get the data. Our goal is to kind of, depending when the data is available, we'll be working through that for February, March when the revenue requirement can start meeting about some of those discussion points and talking about load and everything else that time. April, May will probably focus on the cost of service analysis, and then rate design will follow. We'll definitely be having meetings throughout these timelines to give you the updates as we have the information available through multiple meetings, not just one big meeting at the end or something like that.
Yeah. Great. I had a question for Joy. Joy, I know you've worked in the power side of things for other utilities in the past when we were talking at BPA and anything else. Does anything pop into your mind about how, you're seeing kind of how we've structured rates? I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you just, I don't know if this makes you think about anything from kind of your past of what we're dealing with, if you have anything that you would want to add, or you're like, hey, no, this sounds great, I'm still learning and happy just to be here, or if you have any wisdom to share based on your background from, especially like where we're going with BPA and things like tier 1 and that kind of stuff, and kind of rate design and the messages we're sending our customers with our rate design.
Well, first of all, I'd say that I'm really still in the kind of the sponge mode right now, but I think I would really like an opportunity to talk to FCS and maybe be part of some of the conversations that you all are having to kind of understand, particular issues we have here in Jefferson County PUD. But I would say generally, pretty familiar with the whole cost of service study and kind of the format, and it all seems pretty standard to what I'm used to seeing. But some of the things that have been brought up, such as EV rate, the AMI meter, you know, some of those particular things that are on the horizon, I think we need to pay special attention to. So I would just generally agree, think that we're kind of heading down the right path right now. So look forward to being involved in the conversations going forward.
Okay, thank you.
So one last point, maybe we've made it along the way, and this is for staff as well as FCS, and that's a little bit of history and information on what costs or charges go into the base rate as opposed to what we're basing our consumption rates on, what cost or expenses go into those. I think that would be helpful to know eventually as we have to make decisions on what, if there's going to be an increase, you know, why we're going to pick one over the other.
Definitely.
Okay, a recurring and long-standing debate on that one. Are you done, Sergey?
That's it. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Any additional questions by commissioners or the public? Not seeing them. Okay, so are we done with FCS presentation as a topic? Okay.
Thank you.
So the next, yeah, really good job.
Great.
That-
Thank you very much.
It
Thanks,
did
super
reinforce
helpful.
in me, I do not want to be dealing with water rates and electric rates on the same agenda, because that was a lot of stuff to go through. Okay, so our next item titled Executive Session 1 is an executive session to discuss with legal counsel potential litigation to which the PUD is likely to become a party per RCW 42.30.110 subsection 1 subsection I. And how much time do we think we need for this executive session?
Because we have a 12:30 hard stop, 15 minutes.
Okay, we'll say 15 minutes. Can we have a 5-minute break?
Let's do a 5-minute.
Before that, I need a little break. Is that okay with you, Ken? So we'll actually we'll just say we'll start at noon. 4 minutes, start at noon, and should come out of that executive session at roughly 12:15. That'll be followed by a second executive session. And I'll just say for anybody tuned in, we are not planning any action after that. So if you want to go get your day started, go for it. But we will reconvene at roughly 12:15, and we're going to take a break, but then we are going to go directly into executive session. Is that okay, Joel? Can I do it that way?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank
Okay, thank you, Will. It is now 12:16. We have completed our first executive session. We're going into our second executive session. This executive session is to discuss with legal counsel potential litigation to which the PUD is likely to become a party per RCW 42.30.110 subsection 1 subsection I. I realize it's the same one, but it's a different legal issue. So we had to have two separate executive sessions. This will also be 15 minutes. So we should come out of this meeting at about 12:32, and we are now going into executive session. Mike, there we go. We have completed our second executive session. Before we adjourn the meeting, I just wanted to remind everybody that at the last board meeting, we have adjusted the times our meetings are going to start. So our regular business meetings on the first and third Tuesdays will now start at 4 o'clock. And if we have the need for an executive session, we will call that as a special meeting. But going forward, at least we're going to try to have our regular business meetings at 4. And I guess I was just going to ask you, Kevin, do you know if we're going to need an executive session before that next board meeting on the 16th?
As of today, we will not have an executive session.
But that could change.
That could
And I would just ask the commissioners to please keep your calendars open. So if we need a 3 o'clock meeting that day, we can do it on, 24-hour notice, et cetera. Well, thank you, everybody. Hope you stay reasonably dry and warm, and we are adjourned.
Thank you. See you, everybody.